My wife arrived from the company party with men's perfume on her clothes. The instant she walked through the door, something inside me broke. The smell was strong, striking, it wasn't mine. I knew the perfume she wore, the way she smelled when she came home, but this was different. The clothes were impeccable, the hair was straightened, the lipstick was slightly smudged on the lips. She smiled as if nothing was wrong. And it was exactly at that moment, in that millisecond between his arrival and the forced smile that formed on his face, that I made my decision. She shook her hair and threw her bag on the sofa, as she always did. His voice was light, casual, as if the night had been just one of many. It was incredible, love. You can't imagine how much fun I had. The chef announced promotions, and the food was great. You should have gone. Your attempt to sound normal disgusted me. He looked at me, waiting for me to say something, maybe a, "That's good, darling," or a, "I'm happy for you," but all I could do was fix my eyes on the collar of his blouse, where the masculine perfume still permeated like an invisible mark of betrayal. The silence between us grew thicker. I could feel the tension in the way she avoided my gaze. Maybe he realized that I already knew. Maybe he felt something was wrong. But even so, he tried to continue the charade. He walked over to me, put his hands on my shoulders and kissed my face. I felt on my skin the touch of lips that had probably kissed another man that night. My stomach turned. "Are you well?" she asked, a trace of concern in her voice. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. How could she ask that? How could she look into my eyes and pretend nothing had happened? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment crush me. I stared at his expression, searching for a crack in the perfect mask he wore. But she was good. Too good. Maybe I had already done this before. Maybe this wasn't the first time she'd come home with the scent of another man clinging to her skin. That's when I said it. Calmly, without hesitation. I want a divorce. Her smile faded. His eyes blinked rapidly, his breathing faltered. She laughed nervously, as if she had heard a bad joke. What? What are you talking about? I crossed my arms and looked at her like someone seeing a stranger. You know what I'm talking about. She hesitated, took a step back, her expression now filled with tension. The theater was over. You're exaggerating. Just because I went to a party. Please don't be ridiculous. I'm not the one being ridiculous here. You know that. The cold tone of my voice made her lose her pose for a moment. His eyes scanned the room, as if searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. And then came the denial. Like always. I didn't do anything wrong. You are delusional. I leaned against the table, not taking my eyes off her. You came home smelling like another man. Your lipstick is smudged. Do you really think I'm stupid enough to swallow that story? She swallowed hard. You are paranoid. It was a party, there were a lot of people. It doesn't mean anything. I laughed. A bitter, suffocated laugh. So tell me, what was his name? The silence was deafening. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. For the first time, I saw his mind working to find a plausible excuse, a convincing lie. But there was no escape. The seconds dragged by like blades cutting through skin. I could see the guilt, the fear. And then came the explosion. You are making a fuss over nothing. I didn't do anything. Are you going to throw everything away because of a smell? I'm not throwing anything away. You were the one who played. Now, I'm just finishing what you started. The color in his face disappeared. The shock was visible. She never expected me to react like this. I didn't expect me to make such a quick, firm decision. Maybe he thought I would swallow the lie, that I would be just another man who prefers to pretend that nothing happened in order to maintain a dying marriage. But I was not that man. She came closer again, her hands shaking, trying to touch me, but I pulled away. Please. Can we talk about this? Now do you want to talk? Now that you realize you no longer have control of the situation. She blinked, trying to find words that would change my mind. But it was already too late. I had already made my decision. And the worst was yet to come. I had no idea what I would discover in the following days. Of how far she had gone. Of the plan she had set up behind my back. The real reason behind all that. And what I did when I found out. Well, this is what's going to change everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, the betrayal never will be romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictitious, but they carry brutal truths about how betrayal destroys lives, families, and trusts that can never be restored. Get ready for a story shocking, intense, and full of twists. Every detail was thought of show the relentless consequences of disloyalty. Now, open your ears wide, because what comes next, you will never forget. The night was warm, a light breeze passed through the quiet streets, bringing with it a mixed aroma of night flowers and the warm asphalt of the day that was ending. In the middle-class neighborhood where they lived, house lights discreetly illuminated the sidewalks, and the sound of distant traffic was a constant background sound. It was an ordinary night, like so many others had been for Daniel and Laura in recent years. A stable, predictable marriage, almost meticulously structured into routines that seemed immutable. Daniel, a 38-year-old man, tall, with firm features and an analytical eye, has always been someone who values effort and dedication. He had worked for more than 15 years in the financial sector, where his talent for numbers and impeccable discipline made him a respected professional. He was not a man of excess, he had never needed that to feel satisfied. What he valued most was the feeling of security, the comfort of knowing that his life was under control. His marriage to Laura represented exactly that, a safe haven, a story built step by step, with commitment and responsibility. Laura, in turn, had always been the sweet and determined woman he had met in college. Younger than Daniel by 3 years, she had a vibrant personality that, over the years, had molded itself to the stability that marriage offered. In the beginning, her spontaneity and energy were characteristics that fascinated him. I liked how she lit up the places she went, her loud laugh and the enthusiasm with which she talked about her plans for the future. Over time, however, the routine made that intensity soften. Her work as an administrative manager took up a good part of her time, and her marriage, previously full of surprises and discoveries, became solid ground, but without great emotions. The relationship between the two was based on respect and companionship. They weren't the type of couple who fought over small things, nor did they make declarations of love all the time. There was affection, there was care, but there was also a distance that had silently formed over the years. The conversations, previously full of dreams and desires, were limited to household bills, weekly commitments, vacation planning that, most of the time, ended up being postponed. Daniel noticed this change, he felt that something inside him had also changed, but he had never considered it a problem. After all, wasn't that how all marriages went after a while? That night, he watched the clock on the dining table. The hands showed 10:30, and the house was silent. He picked up the glass of whiskey he had poured for himself and took a sip, feeling the heat of the liquid go down his throat. Laura hadn't yet arrived from the company party. She had mentioned the event during the week, said it would be an important celebration, that everyone would be present. It wasn't the first time she had participated in these get-togethers, and he had never minded. I trusted her. He had always trusted. But that night something felt different. Time passed slowly, and her absence weighed heavily in a way he couldn't explain. He remembered when the nights were different. From when he looked forward to the moment when Laura would come home after work, with an easy smile and a quick kiss before plopping down on the sofa next to him. There was a time when the simple fact of being together was enough. When did this change? When did it become just two people sharing the same house, but without really sharing their lives? He tried to push his thoughts away, focus on the work that awaited him the next morning. But his mind was still stuck with the memory of Laura smiling as she got ready for the party. I was radiant that night. The chosen dress seemed to have been designed to impress, her hair was impeccable, and the perfume she wore was stronger than usual. He noticed this, but didn't comment. Maybe he should have said something, maybe he should have praised her, held her waist longer when she kissed him goodbye. But he didn't say anything. He just watched as she left, and now, hours later, her absence filled the space in a suffocating way. The clock struck 11 at night when the sound of keys turning in the lock finally broke the silence. Daniel remained sitting on the sofa, the glass still in his hands, as he watched Laura enter. She smiled when she saw him there, as if everything was normal. His eyes analyzed every detail, the sparkle in her eyes, the way she fixed her hair, the way the dress molded to her body. She looked different, like someone who carried with her the remnants of an unforgettable night. It was incredible, love. The party was lively, the music was great, everyone had a great time, she said, as she walked to the kitchen to get a glass of water. Daniel nodded, without saying anything. The smell that came with her was intense, a mix of men's perfume and the fragrance she used to wear herself. Something inside him trembled, a sudden restlessness took over his thoughts. He felt the air become heavier, and suddenly the distance between them seemed immensely greater than ever before. Laura continued talking about the party, mentioning names of colleagues, describing funny situations that happened. She spoke as if she needed to fill the silence, as if the normality of her words could mask anything else. But Daniel didn't listen. His mind was distant, trapped in an uncomfortable sensation that grew by the second. The glass in his hand was almost empty when he finally stood up. He walked towards her, watching her every movement, every expression. She didn't look away, but there was something there. A subtle hesitation, a nervousness masked by the casual tone of his voice. The warm night breeze still came through the window, bringing a mixed scent from the street, but all he could smell was the scent permeating her clothes. The house, once a home of security and stability, now felt like uncertain territory. Every detail of the night fit together like an incomplete puzzle, and the lack of answers was what bothered the most. Daniel wanted to believe it was all in his head. He wanted to believe that his mind was playing tricks, that the discomfort he felt was nothing more than tiredness and paranoia. But something told him that this night was not like the others. Something told him that, from then on, his life would never be the same. The silence between Daniel and Laura had become a constant presence in the following days. It wasn't something declared, there were no direct confrontations, but the weight of the unspoken words hung in the air, making every little moment between the two a kind of test. Daniel tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that perhaps his mind was creating paranoia where there was nothing, but the restlessness wouldn't leave him. Since that night, his perception of Laura had changed. Her looks, her gestures, the way she used her cell phone more frequently, the moments when she seemed absorbed in thoughts she didn't share. None of this was new, but now he perceived every detail differently, as if he were watching a play in which he already knew the ending but couldn't accept it. He didn't want to be that kind of husband who was suspicious for no real reason. He had always hated this idea, he had always prided himself on being rational and trustworthy, on not being trapped by childish jealousy. But this wasn't a matter of empty distrust, it was an instinct, a feeling that grew every day. The smell on her clothes, the hesitation in her eyes, the way she walked away from him without anything being said. Something had changed, and Daniel knew he wasn't imagining things. Doubt was like a knife sinking in slowly, and he needed the truth, no matter how much he feared what he would find. That afternoon, as he worked from home, his mind wandered. Laura had left early, saying she needed to sort out a few things before work ended. Something about an important project at work, a meeting that came up at the last minute. He agreed without question, but as soon as the door closed behind her, he felt his chest tighten. An unknown impulse took over him, and before he could rationalize it, He picked up his cell phone and opened the tracking app they had both installed months ago for emergencies. It wasn't something they used often, just a safety feature. But now, as he watched the small icon with Laura's location moving, he felt a chill run down his spine. She wasn't going to the office. The car was traveling along streets that were not part of the normal route. He watched the path set, the minutes passing slowly as the bubble of anguish in his chest grew. When the stopping point finally appeared on the screen, his stomach dropped. A hotel. Small, discreet, located away from busy centers. The kind of place someone would choose for encounters that needed to be kept secret. The air seemed to disappear for an instant. The world around him lost its sounds, everything was reduced to that small icon on the map, indicating the inevitable. Laura was there, and there was no more room for doubt. His heart was beating so hard he could barely hear his own thoughts. He stood still, his cell phone shaking between his fingers, trying to process what that moment meant. Every possibility, every justification he tried to create for himself collapsed before it was even formulated. He knew. I always knew. And now the truth was exposed before him, naked and raw. He took the car keys without thinking, without planning. He needed to see it with his own eyes. I needed to confirm. The journey to the hotel was torture, each traffic light, each curve seemed to drag on in slow motion. His chest was heavy, his thoughts were racing and disorganized. I had often imagined how I would react if I ever went through something like this, but no assumption compared to what I felt now. It was a mix of anger, pain and disbelief. He never imagined that Laura, his Laura, would be capable of something like this. When he parked near the entrance, he didn't get out immediately. He lay there, breathing deeply, trying to find some strength in the chaos of his emotions. The hotel was neither luxurious nor decadent. It was the kind of place meant to be discreet, no questions asked, no compromising records. She felt a sour taste in her mouth as she realized how perfectly everything fit together. He entered the lobby without hesitation, his entire body tense. The attendant, a bored middle-aged man, looked at him with a blank look. Daniel walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in his own mind, like a clock counting down the seconds before the explosion. The room number was there, in front of him. He knew Laura was on the other side of that door. I could hear her laughing. A soft, muffled laugh, accompanied by a male voice he didn't recognize. His body reacted before his mind. He knocked on the door hard, 3 times. Silence fell on the other side. I could hear whispers, an anxious murmur. Hurried steps. When the door opened, there was nothing more to be said. Laura was there, her hair messy, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted in absolute shock. Behind her, a man he had never seen before was adjusting his shirt, clearly taken by surprise. The world seemed to stop for a moment, frozen in her guilty expression, in the petrified look of someone who knew there was no way out. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't scream, he didn't move. He just stood there, observing the scene that he could never erase from his memory. The air between them was suffocating, filled with everything that had never been said, with all the certainties that were now confirmed in the worst possible way. Laura tried to say something, but her voice broke. The man behind her took a step back, as if seeking a silent escape, but Daniel didn't even care about him. His eyes were fixed on her, on the woman he thought he knew so well. And then, finally, he took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. How long? Laura's silence was the only answer he needed. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the pain to pierce his chest like a hot blade. When he opened them again, he felt something different grow inside him. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, something that would change everything from that moment on. He didn't yet know what would come next. But he knew that betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. And that, deep down, something much worse was yet to come. The silence between Daniel and Laura was dense, filled with something that neither of them dared to name yet. She was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, with her eyes downcast, her fingers intertwined in a restless movement. He, standing near the door, arms crossed, face impassive. The lover had disappeared minutes before, leaving behind only concrete proof of everything Daniel feared. But now, it wasn't just the betrayal that was eating away at him. It was something bigger, something he still couldn't define, but it was there, pulsing, waiting to be discovered. Laura tried to speak, but her voice broke. He took a deep breath, tried again, but all that came out was a shaky murmur. He watched her, waiting. I didn't want to make it easy for her. I didn't want her to think that any justification would be enough. She looked up, hesitantly, and her voice came out in a barely audible whisper. He said he didn't understand, that things weren't that simple. That none of this had started the way he thought. Daniel narrowed his eyes. This was not what he expected to hear. What else was there to understand? Wasn't what he had seen enough? But something about the way she avoided his gaze, the way she bit her lower lip like she did when she was about to admit something serious, made him realize there was more. Much more. He approached, keeping his voice steady. He asked how long, he asked if that was the only one. She hesitated. He said no, that he wasn't the only one, and then his heart seemed to break again. But before he could react, Laura continued. He said he needed to tell him everything, that he deserved to know, that things went beyond what he imagined. Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What could be worse than what he already knew? She started slowly, the words coming out with difficulty. He said he didn't plan any of this, that it all started innocently, but that, over time, things got out of control. That the lover of that night meant nothing, that, in fact, nothing he imagined was exactly as it seemed. Daniel laughed, a short, incredulous laugh. How could she try to minimize what happened? How could I think there was any way to justify it? But then she mentioned something that made him freeze. He talked about the house. About the security they had, about the fact that he trusted her, that he never questioned anything. He talked about the assets, the documents, the small changes that had been made in recent months. Daniel frowned. That didn't make sense. What did the house have to do with betrayal? But then she said. He said that, legally, he no longer owned his own house. That she had signed documents that transferred everything into his name without him noticing. And it wasn't just the house. It was the joint account, it was the investments, it was everything. The penny dropped with a brutal impact. He blinked in disbelief and his breathing became heavy. Laura looked away, tears forming in her eyes. She said she didn't want it to be like this, that she was pressured, that she made the wrong decisions and didn't know how to go back. She said there was a bigger plan, a plan in which she was a key player. That her lover wasn't just a lover, but someone who helped her do all this without him suspecting. Daniel felt the world spin around him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, there seemed to be not enough air. How could she? How could someone who shared a whole life with him be capable of something like that? He felt a wave of anger consume him. He asked if everything was a hoax, if at some point she really loved him or if everything was part of this plan from the beginning. Laura denied it, shaking her head desperately, saying that she loved him, that she didn't want things to end like this, that she tried to give up, but it was too late. Daniel laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, filled with hatred and disappointment. She tried to talk more, tried to explain, but he didn't want to listen. Everything he built, everything that was his, was now in the hands of a woman he no longer recognized. A woman who, in addition to betraying him, destroyed him from the inside out without him even realizing it. He ran his hands over his face, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions. But there was no calm. There was nothing but a deep, cutting void. Laura touched his arm, and he recoiled as if he had been burned. I didn't want his touch, I didn't want to hear his voice anymore. He asked what else there was, what else she had done, because now nothing would surprise him anymore. She hesitated. And then, finally, he said what was missing. He said that the lover was not the mastermind of all this. That there was someone else, someone he never suspected, someone who manipulated everything from the shadows. Daniel felt his throat go dry. He asked who. Laura took a second longer than she should have to respond, and when the name left his lips, he felt like he'd been hit. It was someone close. Someone he trusted. Someone he would never imagine. He took a step back, staring at her as if seeing a stranger. His mind spun, replaying every detail, every scene that had previously seemed unimportant. Everything fit now, like a cruel puzzle he never realized he was putting together. Laura tried to speak again, but he raised his hand, silencing her. I didn't want anything else. I didn't want explanations, I didn't want pleas, I didn't even want to understand. Because, deep down, there was nothing left to understand. The only certainty that remained was that he would never be the same after that night. And that everything he had was taken from him without him even realizing it. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the crushing weight of what he had just discovered. When he opened them again, his expression was no longer one of shock or pain. It was something else. Something cold. Something calculating. Something Laura had never seen before. He knew what he needed to do. And this time, he wouldn't miss. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of the newly revealed truth. The name echoed in his mind like distant thunder, reverberating through every memory, every detail he had ignored over the years. He balled his hands into fists, trying to contain the tremor of anger and disbelief that threatened to overwhelm him completely. Laura stood before him, teary eyes, pale face, as if she was waiting for some reaction that didn't come immediately. The silence between the two seemed to expand, dense, suffocating. He took a step back, away from her touch, which was still stretched out in the air, hesitant. The disgust he felt was not just for the betrayal, but for the coldness with which everything had been handled. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was something bigger, something engineered, a plan that used his trust as a weapon to destroy him. And the person who helped Laura, the one who manipulated everything behind the scenes, that was the final stab. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was a dry sound, full of bitterness. Of course it was him. It makes perfect sense now, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Laura swallowed. I didn't want it to be like this, Daniel, his voice was weak, shaky. At first. I didn't even know what I was getting myself into. But you continued, didn't you? He looked up at her, and this time there was something different about them. It was no longer pain. It was no longer shock. It was something cold, calculating. You had a chance to stop, but you chose to continue. You chose to deceive me, rob me, get involved with him. It wasn't that simple, she tried to argue, but her voice cracked when she saw his expression harden even more. Daniel took a step forward, and this time she was the one who backed away. Who else knows about this? His voice was low, threatening. No one. Laura ran her hands over her face, trying to organize her thoughts, but her expression made it clear that she was fighting her own despair. It was supposed to be something, discreet. I didn't want you to find out like that. You didn't want me to find out at all, he corrected, anger dripping from every word. But now that I know, tell me, what was the ultimate plan? What exactly were you guys going to do to me? She hesitated. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, as if she were trapped. Daniel narrowed his eyes, analyzing every detail of her nervousness, every movement, every faltering breath. Then something inside him took hold. He would no longer expect voluntary responses. He would tear out the truth, piece by piece, the only way he knew would work right now. Before Laura could react, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and started dialing a number. The name on the screen flashed in cold letters. The name of the man who was behind it all. Her mentor, her accomplice. Laura's eyes widened, moving towards him, trying to stop him. "What are you doing?" "I'll talk to him," Daniel said, keeping the phone to his ear as he walked away from her. "I'm going to hear from him what you guys are up to." "No." The panic in her voice was real now. "Daniel, please don't do this." But the phone had already been answered. On the other end of the line, a calm and calculated voice echoed, a voice he knew all too well. "Daniel. I was waiting for your call." Daniel's blood ran cold. He pressed the cell phone tighter to his ear, clenching his teeth. "So you already know she told you?" "I knew this moment would come," the voice replied, without a trace of guilt. "The truth always finds a way to come out." Daniel walked to the window, staring at the empty street outside. The world seemed normal, as if nothing was happening. As if your life wasn't being torn apart from the inside out. "I want to know everything," he said between his teeth. "Now." A short laugh came from the other side. "You already know enough. But if you want details, well, I guess there's no point in secrets anymore, is there?" Daniel heard Laura mumble, "No, no, no," repeatedly behind him, but he didn't look away from the voice on the phone. "You always trusted me," the man continued, "and that made everything easier. From the beginning, I knew that the only way to guarantee the success of this plan was through Laura. You would never suspect her. You would never question the documents she signed, the investments she suggested. It was so easy that I honestly thought you would never find out." Daniel felt his fingers close around the cell phone until his knuckles turned white. "You used me." "I used you both," the answer came without hesitation. "And look, everything went exactly as planned. You lost everything, Daniel. And now there's no going back." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the other man's words solidify within him. Yes, he lost everything. But if that man thought that meant he would surrender, he was terribly mistaken. "You got one thing wrong," Daniel finally said, his voice now as cold as a blade about to cut. "I haven't lost everything yet. Because now I know who you are. And that, my dear, changes everything." The line went dead for a second. Then, a new low laugh echoed from the other side. "Let's see what you can do, then. The call has been terminated." Daniel remained still, feeling the anger boil inside him like a storm about to break. He slowly turned around, facing Laura, who now had her face in her hands, sobbing silently. "You helped destroy me," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. "But now you're going to help me get everything back." Laura looked up, red and desperate. I don't know how." Daniel took a step forward, his gaze fixed on hers. "You'll find out." Laura remained silent, her eyes wide and wet, as if she finally understood the gravity of what she had done. Daniel didn't look away. His chest rose and fell in a controlled manner, but inside him, every piece of his sanity seemed to shatter into irreversible fragments. He had confirmation that everything had been meticulously planned. A marriage that turned into a trap, a transaction where he was never aware he was being manipulated. And now, the only thing left for him was to take back what was taken from him, no matter what the cost. Laura tried to touch his arm, hesitantly, as if a simple gesture could reverse years of betrayal and deceit. He walked away. Her gaze was filled with guilt, but there was no more room for regret. Daniel wasn't there to comfort a woman who had helped ruin his life. He wanted something much bigger than that. She swallowed, her voice almost a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel ran his hands through his hair, feeling the crushing weight of every choice he would need to make from now on. He couldn't just accept that. He couldn't afford to lose. But it needed to be strategic. He took a deep breath before looking at her. "You're going to tell me exactly how they did it. Every detail. Everything that was changed. Every document, every signature, every financial transaction. If you want to try to save anything of what's left of your dignity, you'll help me undo what you did. Laura bit her lip, looking away, as if pondering her own undoing. If I tell you everything, you'll turn me in. I could be arrested. He let out a short, humorless laugh. And you think you deserve less than that? She closed her eyes for a moment, her body shaking, but when she looked at him again, there was something new there. Resignation. I don't have a choice, do I? Daniel leaned forward a little, his voice sharp as a razor. None. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. It was gradual. First, access to your accounts. Not completely, just small movements that would not attract your attention. Then came the documents. Small changes in the ownership of the house, in the shares that were in your name. You never checked these details, because you trusted me. I said that I needed your signature, that they were just tax adjustments, that we would make paying taxes easier, and you signed without question. He felt a lump tighten in his throat. Her every word was like a stab, but he needed to hear it. I needed to understand how deep they had gone. And him? How did he get into this? He knew the only way he could get what he wanted was through me, Laura confessed, her voice breaking. He convinced me that you would never realize. He said that when everything was ready, there would be an agreement, that you wouldn't leave completely with nothing. But, it wasn't true. The intention was always to leave you with nothing. Daniel felt his blood boil. How was he so naive? How did he not realize that the man he considered an ally, someone he had trusted for years, was betraying him in the worst way possible? He began to pace the room, feeling his heart hammering in his chest. And now? The question came out harsh, almost a challenge. If I want to reverse this, what do I need to do? Laura hesitated. I don't know if there's a way to reverse everything. He turned so quickly that she took a step back. It's not an option. I won't accept it. She sighed, pressing her fingers against her temples. The money has already been moved. Part of the assets are already in his name. But there is one thing. Daniel waited impatiently. Laura closed her eyes for a moment before continuing. He hasn't completely formalized the transfer yet. There is a transition period, something he mentioned once. The documents haven't been signed in the last step yet. That means, there's still a chance. Daniel took in the information, his mind spinning quickly. If there was a loophole, he would use it. But he knew he couldn't just show up and demand his possessions back. I needed to be smarter than that. You're going to arrange a meeting with him, he finally said, his voice more controlled. He'll say he wants to talk, that he needs to clarify some things before finalizing everything. I'll be nearby. And I'll make sure he has no choice but to return what belongs to me. Laura's eyes widened. Daniel, he is not someone who accepts being confronted easily. He can. I don't care what he can do, he interrupted, his jaw tense. If he thought he could take me down without consequences, he's terribly mistaken. She swallowed hard. What if he refuses? Daniel smiled, but there was no humor on his face. Then I make him regret underestimating me. The silence between them was interrupted only by Laura's rapid breathing. She knew there was no going back. He knew that any decision made from then on would dictate his destiny. And for the first time, he realized that Daniel was no longer the man he had known. Something inside him had changed. Something that could never be reversed. She picked up her cell phone with trembling fingers, typing a short message. Daniel watched every movement, waiting. When she pressed send, their fate had been sealed. The game was now different. And this time, he was in charge. Laura dropped her cell phone on the table, her fingers trembling, her eyes glued to the screen as she waited for a response. Daniel didn't look away from her, every detail of his expression betrayed the growing tension. She breathed shallowly, as if with every second that passed, it became more difficult to maintain her composure. He, on the other hand, was unshakable. Now that he had a plan, now that he saw a way to recover what had been stolen from him, his mind remained cold and calculating. There was no more room for hesitation. The cell phone vibrated and her eyes widened. Daniel crossed his arms, waiting. Laura hesitated for a moment, then swiped the screen to read the message. He wants to meet me tomorrow night. In a discreet restaurant, as always. Her voice was low, as if she were trying to predict Daniel's reaction. He nodded, unsurprised. Great. You go, and I'll be nearby. She looked up at him, uneasy. And then? What are you going to do? Daniel tilted his head slightly, watching her as if analyzing her real concern. It doesn't matter to you now. Just do your part. She swallowed hard, her eyes sweeping the room as if looking for a way out, but there was no way out for her. All that was left for her was to do what he demanded and hope that it would end without the worst happening. The next day, Daniel spent the entire day planning each step. I had checked the information provided by Laura, understood the flow of transactions and realized where I could still act. His opponent hadn't expected to be confronted like this, hadn't expected him to fight back. And that was what gave him the advantage. When night fell, he was already in position. The chosen restaurant was small, reserved, perfect for discreet meetings. Outside, Daniel watched through the large windows, awaiting their arrival. His mind was sharp, his patience controlled. He wouldn't let anger get the better of him now. Not yet. Shortly after 8, Laura arrived. Her face carried a nervous expression, and her eyes swept the room before she entered. Minutes later, the other man appeared. He walked with confidence, a discreet smile on his face, as if he knew he had control of the situation. He sat at the table with Laura, ordering wine as if this were just another night. Daniel felt his adrenaline rising as he headed into the restaurant. With each step, his mind reviewed every detail of what he was about to do. He crossed the room without haste, but firmly. When he reached the table, Laura's gaze fixed on him, alarmed. The other man looked up in surprise, but quickly masked his reaction with a calculated smile. Daniel, he said, his voice calm, as if he had found him by chance. What a coincidence. Daniel pulled up a chair, sitting down uninvited. I don't believe in coincidences. Laura tensed, her hands resting on the table, her fingers intertwining. The other man adjusted his jacket sleeve, maintaining his composure. So what brings you here? Daniel leaned forward slightly. Let's cut out the beating around the bush. I know everything. A gleam of interest came into the other man's eyes. All. Daniel didn't blink. Every detail. Every transaction. Every fraudulent signature. I know exactly what you did and I know what you plan to do next. The man's expression remained relaxed, but his gaze became sharper. He took a sip of the wine, resting the glass on the table before answering. And what do you intend to do with that information? Daniel smirked. First, I want to give you an opportunity. You will return everything you stole. Every penny. You will reverse the transfers, sign whatever documents I want, and get out of my life forever. The man laughed, leaning back in his chair. And why would I do that? Daniel approached closer, his tone becoming icy. Because if you don't, I guarantee you will pay a much greater price. The silence that followed was piercing. Laura looked from one to the other, the tension on her face evident. The man in front of him seemed to consider his words, evaluating how far he could go without losing control of the situation. He sighed, feigning disinterest. What if I just refuse? Daniel rested his elbows on the table, maintaining apparent calm. Then I will destroy everything you have built. I know your business, I know where to attack. You may have been smart until now, but I made a mistake, I underestimated you. Now it is your turn to underestimate me. The man was serious for a moment, analyzing Daniel, trying to gauge how much of that was true. The tension between the three was so thick it could be cut with a blade. Finally, he let out a short, humorless smile. "You learn to play," he murmured. "But it doesn't have enough power to make me give in." Daniel kept his gaze steady. "Not yet. But I can guarantee that if you keep doing this, you'll regret it. And I'm not asking. I'm giving you one last chance." The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes shining with curiosity. "What if I sign the documents? What if I give back what I took? Will you leave me alone?" Daniel nodded. "As long as you stay away forever." He took a deep breath, assessing the risks. Then, after a long moment, he took out his cell phone and typed something. "Very well," he said, sliding the device onto the table for Daniel to see. "I just sent an order to begin the process of reversing the documents. Within a few hours, it will be done." Daniel took out his cell phone, confirmed the message sent and nodded. "Good. Now get out of here." The man stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "It was interesting doing business with you, Daniel. But don't forget, whoever wins today doesn't always win in the end." Daniel didn't respond. She just watched as he left the restaurant, disappearing into the night. When he turned his gaze to Laura, he saw that she looked relieved, but at the same time devastated. "It's done," she murmured. Daniel stood up, taking one last look at her. "Nothing you do will change what happened. But at least now, you won't carry this around for the rest of your life." She didn't say anything. She just stood there, watching him as he left. Outside, Daniel took a deep breath for the first time in a long time. There was still a lot to do, but one thing was certain: he would never trust anyone in the same way again. And, somehow, that was the most freeing of all. Daniel walked through the restaurant's empty parking lot, feeling the cold wind cut through the night. His steps were steady, but his mind was in a silent whirl. He did it. He would take back what was his. But the taste of victory was not sweet. It was bitter, filled with a weight that could not be lifted. There was no satisfaction in knowing he had beaten someone who should never have been his enemy. Because in the end, he lost much more than money and property. He lost the version of himself that believed in love, in trust, in partnership. Now there was only one man left who had learned to survive. Inside the car, he took a deep breath before starting. The city lights passed by him like blurred figures. He thought about what would come next. The bureaucracy to reverse the transfers, the lawyers, the documents, all of this would take time, but none of that bothered him. What hurt was knowing that a marriage of years, a story built brick by brick, collapsed in such a brutal way. Laura. Her image still persisted in his mind. The desperate look, the trembling voice, the guilt that seemed genuine. But genuine or not, it no longer mattered. He could never look at her again without remembering the betrayal. And, more than that, the destruction she helped cause. When he got home, the feeling of emptiness was overwhelming. The room was dark, silent, but everything there carried traces of the life that one day built alongside it. Every piece of furniture chosen together, every memory deposited in that place now seemed like a ghost haunting every corner. He threw his keys on the table, ran his hands over his face, feeling exhaustion wash over him like a tide. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, the news spread quickly. The man who tried to destroy him has disappeared. No movement in your accounts, no travel records, nothing. It was as if he had evaporated from the face of the earth. Lawyers tried to make contact, investors started to get restless, and soon the police were involved. Nobody knew where he was. And when, days later, a car was found on a deserted road with her phone thrown in the back seat and her wallet intact, it was clear something had happened. But no one knew what. Daniel wasn't surprised. People like this always think they can play with everyone around them without suffering consequences. But sometimes, the tables turn. And when that happens, the board itself becomes a trap. He didn't bother to look for answers. I didn't need them. What mattered was that the danger was gone, and he could finally move on. Laura, on the other hand, was not so lucky. After the confession and exposure of the scheme, his reputation was destroyed. The company I worked for learned about the fraud and opened an investigation. She was fired without the right to any termination and, before long, doors began to close on her. Her former colleagues, the ones she smiled with at company parties, now avoided her. Friends walked away, family members looked at her with judgment in their eyes. And the worst part was that there was no one to blame but herself. He tried to contact Daniel a few times, but he didn't answer. There was nothing more to be said. With no options, she moved far away. A forced restart, without glamour, without plans. Just the weight of guilt and the constant reminder of what he did. She knew she could try to justify her actions, but the truth was one, she chose the path that led her there. And now, there was no going back. For Daniel, the following months were a rebuilding process. Not just of what he had lost materially, but of who he was. For a long time, he avoided getting involved with anyone. His heart still bore deep scars, and trust, once so natural, now seemed like a luxury he could no longer afford. But eventually, life went on. You met someone. Someone unlike anything you've ever had. A woman who didn't demand haste, who didn't ask for guarantees, but who, little by little, made him remember what it was to be happy without having to worry about ulterior motives. He learned to value the comfortable silence beside her, the subtle gestures that said more than words. And, over time, he realized that he didn't need to carry the weight of the past forever. What happened could never be erased, but it also shouldn't define who he would be for the rest of his life. And then, one day, as he looked at the woman next to him and felt peace, he realized that he was finally free. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What would you do if you were in Daniel's place? Comment your opinion and share your reflections. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Here, we never romanticize betrayal. We show the consequences, the harsh truths that many avoid seeing. Because in the end, everything we do comes back to us. Until next time.